right, so let's jump in. So welcome, thanks everybody for joining. This is data cleansing and data prep with Azure Synapse Analytics using data flows. So my name is Mark. My information is on the screen on the slide there. It's Mark Kromer. My Twitter accounts, my Twitter handle is there. Please don't mind that you'll see me drinking some coffee, or a lot of coffee actually, during the session. It's a little on the early side for me, so don't hold me to anything I say that's incorrect. I'm blaming it on it being early in the morning. So I am a principal PM in the Azure Data Governance team at Microsoft, and yeah, I focus every day of my life is on pipelines and data flows and all those kinds of things. And I'm actually in the Azure Data Factory team within data governance. And so what I wanted to talk about today was data cleansing and prep with Synapse Analytics using data flows. Now, what I'm going to talk about today and introduce you to is how to use data flows for this purpose. Now, data flows is actually technology that came out of Data Factory. And I want to really focus on Synapse Analytics today. So what you're going to hear and what you're going to see is that, let's say it this way, if you're familiar with Data Factory and you've used Data Factory, you should, obviously this is going to be a very easy transition for you, and you're going to look at these things, you're going to say, well, that's actually Data Factory, and it really is. Data Factory is essentially embedded within Synapse Analytics. And the naming is a little different, right? We usually refer to those things as pipelines and data flows as opposed to Data Factory pipelines and data flows. But you're not going to really see very many differences. And those differences that you might see, I'll try to call out. And just keep in mind that those differences between Data Factory and Synapse Analytics, the pipelines and the data flows, those are fading away as we put more work into completing the work items and engineering around making sure there's parity between Data Factory and Synapse Analytics. All right, so enough of that setup. Let's jump into how to clean data and prep data within Azure Synapse Analytics and using data flows. Now, first of all, I think that I have a spelling mistake in my slides. That's a great start. Let me fix that. I'm going to go into slideshow mode on this one, just so you can see it better. By the way, I do have a link at the end of where to go to download the slides. I'm going to walk you through some examples in the UI, and I have a whole tutorial I just completed that'll send you. That'll include the link for that as well with the sample data. So don't feel like, if I'm going fast, that's, you're going to miss anything. You're going to be able to come back and regroup and go through all these things on your own at your own pace. I did a live training a few weeks ago but it was, I think the session was about an hour on data flows and pipelines in Synapse. And I just I really slid through everything in a real hurry, really quickly. And one of the feedbacks I got was Mark, you need to slow down. You need to provide a tutorial on how this stuff is done. This is going to sound crazy, and but you have to believe I'm being completely honest when I say this, is that I get really excited by this kind of stuff. This is my life, and I love working with data and analyzing data, and seems a little weird, but it's the truth. So anyway, that's why I go fast sometimes. So why would you need to worry about data cleansing and data prep? And it's because data within its within fundamentally data is going to be a little messy, and it's not going to be neatly organized in a way that's going to make it easy for you to analyze. Otherwise, you wouldn't need necessarily complex tools and professionals like yourselves, like data engineers, to be able to do this work, to make it so that the business that you're working for can gain some value out of it. It's a very just incredibly important process, and the fact that we do this every day, I think, is an absolute just kind of blessing, and I love doing it. But it's complicated, and it has a lot of challenges associated with it. And we try to make that process as easy and as painless, or I should say, painless is a good way to put it, for you within Data Factory and Synapse Analytics. So what you need to do, typically these are some of the things that you would do when you're working with data warehousing or data analytics. And I want to be very clear that in Synapse, and to be honest with you, in Azure all up, because we're in the cloud and we really emphasize the data lake pattern, is that the patterns are very similar to data warehousing. It's essentially what we have sort of referred to as big data analytics, right? And it's not too different from traditional data warehousing, but there are some key differences. We'll go through some of those as we go through the session here today. By the way, every time I say data lake, I always think back to one of the companies I worked for in the past is called Pentaho. Believe it or not, I've been in ETL and data analytics for longer than you can even imagine. And our CTO at Pentaho was actually the one who coined the term data lake. And it's just fascinating for me to see like how it's just kind of become like just a regular part of everyone's vernacular in data engineering now. Anyway, sidetrack. Let's go through what the things are for data analytics and data warehousing scenarios. Okay, this is just a sampling of the 8 kind of top things that you'll see. I don't know why I picked 8. I should have probably picked 10. That's a nice round number, but that's just the way my brain works. You're going to need to do things like verify data types and lengths. You're going to have to learn or use the data flows and Synapse Analytics to figure out how to handle nulls. What do you want to do with nulls? Do you want to pass nulls through? Do you want to change those to more meaningful values? Do you want to change those to random values or values in a sequence? Domain value constraints are something you have to build. This is a part of data quality and data cleansing, where if you get a value that comes in and it's not within a domain constraint. A domain constraint, by the way, an example would be, let's see, an example would be that the value of maybe, how about the number of days in July has to fall within 1 to 31. I think I got that right for July. Or the values could be something that's business oriented. So it could be that the number of locations that we have for our stores is 300. So any value outside of that is an invalid value. Single source of truth, master data, very common. We're not going to talk about that today. That's a very large area, but it's something to think about. And as we sort of as I go through how to use data flows, think about how this integrates with what's called Azure Purview, the public preview that we have for Azure Purview, which all ties together very, very tightly with what we're doing here with data quality, data cleansing, and metadata management, and master data management. Later arriving dimensions, because we're going to be working with data warehousing and analytics, you're going to build star schemas. Yes, star schemas are still there. So dimensional modeling is very important. And so how to handle late arriving dimensions is very important, especially again in lake environments, because the data is going to be coming in many different varieties and many different speeds. So you can't guarantee that there's going to be a dimension member for everything that you arrive. That's a fact, all right? By the way, hopefully that all made sense. If you, we have to do a separate session on slow change in dimensions so that we can talk about dimensional modeling and make that stuff make sense for you. Lookups are going to be critical. You're going to need to take some data coming in, and in most cases, the data is going to be not all self-contained, right? It's not going to be completely denormalized. So there's going to be an aspect of you needing to go and look up referential data and to be able to bring that in together when you're performing this work. And within Synapse Analytics and data flows, the ability to do lookups, cache lookups, uncached lookups is directly built in, because it's very, very important. So we try to make that as easy as possible. Extremely important, number 7, PII masking. Now, what we have today in data flows that I'll show you is really one way of masking. It's essentially encrypting data. However, we are working on some functions within the expression language that make it a two-way masking. And then data analytics, aggregations, all that, all critical, all built into the tool. I'm going to probably pause on those or just skip the rest of those, and we'll talk about it in more detail as we do a demo. Now, another thing you need to do is prepare that data downstream for data scientists. So some of the things you're going to focus on as you do that is you're going to look at how to deduplicate data. Deduping is, again, a very, very common thing, especially in Lake. Descriptive data statistics. I love this area. This is data profiling, right? This is how to explore your data in a way that brings forth value out of that data. Otherwise, it's just data. I mean, the lake is just, mounds and mountains of data that isn't necessarily making sense until you as a data engineer have used the tool like data flows to be able to bring meaning to the data. So you need to understand what is the length, the type, how many nulls are there, what's the mean, median, average of the data. Look at the also when you're exploring data, what is the frequency distribution? So how are the values distributed? How many, what is the cardinality of that data, right? Is essentially what you're looking at here as well. Is how many times, does a term appear within a string column? It doesn't have to be string, but within a column. Again, you're going to have to handle missing values. Essentially, as a data warehouse professional, when you're producing meaningful analytics for business users, you're going to worry about nulls more probably more frequently than what data scientists refer to as missing values. So if you're downstream consumers, data scientists, and they come to you as a data engineer, and they say, hey, within your ETL, you need to find a way to handle these missing values because it's just completely blowing up my my model. You need to be able to handle missing values, which is really how to deal with nulls. Enumerations and lookups, that came from the previous slide as well. There's another thing that's important here. Again, I don't know why I picked 7. Just seemed like maybe just the brain dump that I was thinking of at the time. Value replacement, because sometimes value replacement is important because a lot of times when you're looking at categorical data, as data scientists refer to it as, the values have to be within that category. However, the data sometimes is not completely clean. Sometimes is almost inevitably going to not be clean, and so you need to replace values with what a correct value is. What a value is that is understood by the model that is being trained or being fed. So you need to know about value replacement. You would get this information from the data science team as you build your ETL in Synapse Analytics. Last but not least, metadata validation, very, very important, because even though we're talking about what the data actually looks like here, the key thing to think about is what is the layout of the data? Is the schema correct? Does the schema change often? And by the way, when I just asked that question, it's kind of a foolish question if you think about it. Is the data going to change? Yeah, the layout of the data is going to change. Just keep that as an axiom. The data always changes in the lake. The data itself, the size, the shape of the data, that just happens. And so there's a flexibility built into data flows that I think you're really going to like, which is called a schema drift. And so that allows you to have to handle flexible schemas easily, and to be able to do what we call late binding, right? So when you build your ETL and your structures within data flow, you don't have to bind it directly to a well-known schema. You can if you want to, and if you're lucky enough, that makes your job a lot easier. But in most cases, it's going to be changing quite a bit. And so that's going to be something that you're going to have to understand and work with within your data. So let's go into some of these things. I have about, I think about 5-6 more minutes of slides here, and then we're going to go into what this stuff actually looks like when you're inside of Synapse. But there's some really good information, I think, in these slides that you'll be able to also look at afterwards, that really kind of introduces you to what these different areas I talked about look like. I only have a few of the areas highlighted here, but they're very important. Okay. Now, remember, we're going to be working with Synapse Analytics today. So when you're working with data profiling, the 2 pictures I have for you are examples of what profiling your data looks like. On the left-hand side is what it looks like in mapping data flows, which is what we're focusing on today. On the right-hand side is when you surface that in a pipeline using Power Query. Power Query is not yet landed in Synapse Analytics. That's going to be coming soon. But the Power Query is only going to be there in Data Factory today. Okay, just keep that in mind. But this slide is kind of covering both of those tools again, because Data Flows is a technology that comes out of the team that I am in, which is the Data Factory team, and we bring that forward into Synapse. Okay, so just keep that in mind. The way you're going to do your profiling in Synapse is going to be through Data Flows, Power Query. When that lights up in Synapse, you'll be able to use that. So this is your summary statistics. You see, we'll focus on the left-hand picture, which is where you're seeing the value distribution. So we talked about value distributions, frequency of values within that data. You could also use this to see what those values are. So in this case, this is an example of the column is called event type 2. It is a string, even though it has numeric data in it. And so you may want to do something like you may want to cast this data. So you're going to use what's known as a derived column. So not only should you be familiar with what we're going to talk about today in Synapse Analytics if you have used Data Factory, but also if you use SSIS. So SSIS, you know, is in ADF is also driven out of the same product management team, program management team that I'm in Microsoft Azure Data Governance. And so I think that if you're familiar with SSIS, a lot of these things should be, we intended these things to be very smooth transition for you from on-prem SSIS into Synapse Analytics and Data Factory. Okay. So you may want to cast this. You also would look at this data and you would say that there's a lot of NAs. So those NAs, and you'll see that in the large bar there. So a lot of the NAs, you may say that both for the data scientist and for the business user who are going to consume your data through this ETL process, that those are not, NA can't work. It's going to have to be changed to something else. 77.2% of the data in this example had NA as the value. So you'll want to use a derived column within your data flow to change that to something else in most cases. You know, just figure out with your business, work with your end users and figure out what they want that to be. And it's very easy to change that. What else can you look at this? You can also see things like if this were numeric, you'd see the standard deviation on it, the min max, those things. But here as strings, you can see that the minimum value is the minimum length is 2 and the maximum length is 2. That's because everything is a 2-digit number. And there are lots of nulls in there as well, so you also want to have some null handling in there. Okay, so use the profiling to get a snapshot into what you want to or need to do with your data and how you're going to work with that data and do things like this slide, which is replacing values. So here's an example of how you'd replace the value using a formula within Synapse Analytics data flows. So in this case, this first one I'm saying replace empty strings with nulls. All right, so what is an empty string? Well, an empty string can be evaluated using this formula as an example. There's different ways to do it, but an example would be if the length of the incoming column, in this case title, is 0, that means it's an empty string, okay, which is different than null. Keeping that in mind, this is very SQL, database-based. So if the length of the column is 0, then I'm going to convert that to null. Otherwise, I'm going to keep the title. Okay, do you get what that's doing? This is saying, by the way, I always love the formula languages that we use where it says if. So this is actually, I think, pronounced if. Anyway, so if the length of title is 0, then we're going to convert that to a null. So when this lands inside of, let's say, your Synapse SQL pools, now it's going to have a null value in there. Or you could just leave it as such. Maybe do a change the toString null to be an empty quote, or an NA, like I'm doing down here, which is that if the customer name is null, so is null is a built-in function in Synapse Data Flows. And the third parameter in each of these cases of this function is always going to be an actual, it's the else essentially condition. So in this case, I'm just using the actual incoming value of that row in that column if it's in this case, in the first case, if there actually is some length to the string, which means that it's not an empty string. In the second case, if it's not null. Now, the third important thing to do with replacing values when you're talking about measurements, or measurements is more of a data science term. But so if you're working with your business users, then that may be, a numeric value. If you want to replace that, you're not going to replace it with strings. Instead, you're going to replace it with aggregates in many cases. Right, so missing value, you can replace it with an aggregate. So what you could do is build an aggregate in your data flow that says, give me the median or the average value. And if I see a null or a non-value for this row in this column, this numeric column, replace that with that aggregate. That really helps. That's kind of the way to sort of norm data and get rid of anomalies. I have examples of the language on here, so as you get the slides, you can dig into it. I'd much rather you just kind of open up the UI. We have all of the function language with hundreds of functions. It's all available to you in the UI. It has IntelliSense. It has built-in help. The right-hand side is what the toolbar looks like for all the transformations available to you within data flows. And in this case, we're highlighting the two that I'm using here, which is the derived column and the aggregate. These functions would fall inside of the derived column. And then to get the average down here as an example of the average, to get the average rate, I use 2-decimal average. And then this is an aggregate transformation. So this is a look at all the transformations. Don't have time to go into those today. You will be able to just open up your UI and play with all those different transformations. Yay. All right. Now, another very important thing that you're going to do within your data flows is you're going to very commonly split the data. This is for many different reasons. Let's talk about the two different scenarios we're talking about today for data cleansing. We're talking about the data warehouse, the business user. We're talking about the data scientist and those end users. In both cases, you're going to use two things that I've highlighted here, which is the new branch and also the conditional split. Why I didn't put a red box around conditional split is unknown. The conditional split is this example right here. I think this is supposed to point to conditional split in my slide. font changed or something like that. That's the excuse I'm using. An example of a conditional split is, in this case, I have data coming in that is movie data, and on the top stream, I'm saying just give me movies that were in the year 1980. Everything else or after 1980 will go to the bottom stream. So I've split the stream using conditional split. Again, your SSIS, Data Factory, this is all terminology that comes from SSIS. You should be very familiar with this. It's all here in Synapse Analytics too. The reason you would do this is because you may want to send the data for the data scientists to different models, or they may want to use one set of data, I should say, this is a better example, one set of data for training. And so for training, they may want to say, I want to make sure that I want to test or train the model with all this data. And in the data analytics and the the data warehousing business users scenario, you may want to say that you want to test with a certain set of data. So you want to just send them into this data mart only the movies for the year 1980. So conditional split is the way to do that. Conditional split looks like this down here in the bottom left in terms of how you configure that transformation. So in this case, I'm just using the isNull by name. By the way, it's a function that looks up data by a column name without needing to have that column defined in your metadata. So this will find the column name product ID. This is a great way to do late binding within your data flow. And then this is going to be two different, this will end up with two different streams. The top stream will be called bad schema. The bottom stream will be called good schema. This is a great way to do metadata checking, metadata validation within data flows. So if you've seen Data Factory, you worked with pipelines, you know that there's a get metadata in the pipeline, and then over here in data flow there is a there's a whole set of meta functions or metadata functions. The metadata functions within data flow are much deeper in terms of understanding your data versus get metadata within pipeline, which is really, take a look at things like files that give me the give me details of files that are found in a blob store folder, for example. Okay, that's the difference between those metadata functions. We have to move a little bit faster. Again, I'm getting sidetracked on many different things here, so let's see if I can go a little bit faster. When you're working with metadata, and you're really going to need to do this in terms of data cleansing, is understanding the format and the shape of that data. So you can use pattern matching. So I had the example, the by name function in the previous slide. All these functions are fully documented with some examples online, and it's also the link to the documentation is also within the expression builder in data flows. So you don't need to necessarily learn all these here. You can just follow through. You can follow along with the examples and with the help online. But what you're going to also be able to do is to pattern match columns and values. This is again because the nature of the data lake is that the data is going to be messy and you don't know what the data looks like in every case. It's not the traditional data warehousing models where you're working with well-defined database schemas on the left-hand side and mapping those to well-defined schemas on the right-hand side, and they never change. Or if they change, it has to go through, those changes have to go through like an enterprise architect committee or something of that nature. Those days seem like this kind of work was so much easier, and that's not the case. So that early binding doesn't work well in data lake, and that's why you see this ability to do things like the top, the right-hand side picture is an example of where we're saying that instead of identifying column names, because the column names may not be exactly the same in every file that you're receiving in the lake, instead what you're going to say is look for a column based on position. And this is actually saying, give me every column that is between these two positions in that data. That's how you can address columns within your data without addressing the exact column. All right, I think I've got about 2 more examples here for you, and then we'll do a demo and we'll walk through the tutorial a little bit. The link to the tutorial, by the way, is at the end. So it's completely self-paced. It's about 12 pages long. It's not too bad. And I'd encourage you to kind of do that to learn more about data cleansing with data flows. So you can actually get in there and have your own sort of hands on the keyboard. So now enumerations and lookup is another very great example. When we did data profiling earlier on in this session, we had the example of the values within what is categorized as a string column, but the values were actually numeric. So you may want to cast that, but you also may want to do this, where I'm doing a in the back, the larger picture, the first one is a case statement. So I've sort of hard coded, if you will, the enumerations in here. So I'm turning the numeric values into enumerations. This again is going to be predicated on what your end users ask of you as a data engineer. So building an ETL job, you're going to want to know that, yeah, these need to be translated from numeric values into the string enumerations for that. All right. That may not be the case. It could be that there's there is an ML model at the end that expects these to actually be numeric, or there is a BI reports, a Power BI report that requires these to be strings, in which case then you'll convert. Converting inline is great. The other two screenshots are left-hand side is a cached lookup. So instead, in this case, the source 2 would actually have the values of those event types. Then you would do a lookup and do a cache lookup, which means it's going to be, excuse me, in memory. And then you're going to be able to do a lookup against that data. And it's going to be really fast. The right-hand side is a uncached lookup, which is not going to be as fast, but it could be something that the data changes more often, so you don't want to cache the data. And so you would do that. Also, if the data is very, very large, because again, data lake means that the size of the files could be anywhere from a couple of megs to a couple of terabytes, right? Or even more. So in that case, then caching may not work, because what happens in Synapse Analytics is when you start a data flow, we actually spin up a Spark pool behind the scenes. Data flows in Azure Synapse Analytics execute on Synapse Spark. And so if you're having, thousands, or not thousands, but if you're having millions of rows, it may not fit in memory, so you have to do an uncached lookup. Anyway, just, that's the key point to take away here, is that lookups are very important, and you can do both cached and uncached within Synapse Data Flows. Oh, this is a very, very important topic here. Let's go into this for just a little bit. Deduping data, finding distinct rows. Okay, so I've got a bunch of examples for you. I'm not going to be able to dive into these today, but I do have a link to the documentation. Also, if you look at my blog, so I should have put the link to that. I wonder if maybe I can send some things over. I'll make sure they're in the slides. I'll put it that way. Okay. I have a bunch of examples. The example in the back of the fuzzy matching, that's fuzzy matching in the back, that is actually available to you in the dedupe pipeline template. That's available both in Synapse Analytics and in ADF for data flows. So you can find that. You don't have to worry about building this yourself. Just load that into your pipeline and you'll have a data flow that does fuzzy matching. That's lookup based on actually 3 different things. Sorry, this is deduping based on 3 different things. This deduping will do fuzzy matching. We'll also do different types of matching, where it's not just fuzzy matching, it's also doing things like, if the value is close enough to your original value, then give it a score. So essentially does scoring, right? So that's the second thing. The third thing is it kind of brings us together to a final end score. And then you as ETL developers say that if the score across all these different attributes of my data is greater than, let's say, 75%, then you say that's your likelihood to say that this is a duplicate row. That's a very more advanced way to do deduping. A very simple way is just look for distinct rows. And that link at the top is a snippet. So data flows behind the scenes has a data flow script associated with it within Synapse, and you can take that and you can put those snippets right into your data flow. And there's a distinct row example. It looks like that in the bottom right. That's what the script looks like. It's, if you're familiar with M or writing formulas in Excel, I think you're going to find this very similar to those. But I do want to point out that in the bottom right in the scripts, even if you just edit the script instead of using the UI in Synapse, we actually have IntelliSense and autocomplete for that as well. Fuzzy lookups, I think we probably need to move on to the demo, so I'm going to skip that. We talked a little bit about metadata validation, and then at the end of the slides, when you get these, I have the link to things like a bunch of videos that I've recorded. They're about, one of the videos is less than 15 minutes. I meant them to be bite-sized for how to do things like an overall overview of data quality and data cleansing within Synapse. Don't get hung up on the word ADF or the data factory within these. Data flows are essentially the same in both, so they'll work in both. Link to the slide deck. The tutorial is at the bottom as well, so there's the tutorial for this. Let me actually go into the demo. And the one thing I do want to show you is that tutorial. So as you, that's actually not the tutorial. So as you actually get that, I'm not going to be able to bring it up here. As you actually get to that tutorial, This would be a lot easier, wouldn't it? Oh, I can't click on it either because it's in GitHub and it's going to be a raw file. Oh, well. As you get that tutorial, you'll actually be able to see all of the steps and the formulas that you need to do that I'm going to show you today, because I'm going to go a little quick through this, but use that document to walk through these steps on your own. All right, so here we go. We got about 15 minutes left, and I'm going to leave about 5 minutes for questions if there are any. So let's see if we can kind of crank through some of this. All right, so here we go. So now we are in Synapse Analytics, and I am in I'm in the Storage Explorer within Synapse Analytics. Let me get you a little bit familiar with the layouts and the footprint of the UI. So the user experience is very similar to Data Factory. We intentionally did this so that it's an easy transition for you as a data engineer, and you don't have to relearn a whole set of kind of interactive models as you go from one tool to the other. I think you'll see that purview as well has been made very similar too. So hopefully that is an enjoyable experience for you. That there's a lot of similarities between those. So on the left-hand side of the categories, now these are the same sort of top level categories, or at least similar categories that you'll see in Data Factory, like the manage area and the monitor. So if you've been using Data Factory for a long time, first of all, thank you very much. I appreciate the supports. But you may have also been sort of maybe wondering, and I definitely know you have been because I get a lot of emails and social media comments on this, is why have you been doing things like moving some things into these different categories like monitor and manage, right? I guess manage is more of a good example of that. The reason for those changes over the past 6 months is to sort of align these things within Synapse and Data Factory. And so manage is where you're going to go to do things like manage your link services, your connection to Purview, your integration runtimes, and those things. Monitoring is going to have the same monitoring experience you have in Data Factory, plus the other areas of Synapse. Synapse includes the SQL pools, Spark pools, and all those sorts of things. So all that monitoring is going to be here. But you see that, for example, the pipeline monitoring, that's all the same within here as it is in Data Factory. And when you're working with data flows, this is an example of a pipeline that I executed. This is the monitoring view. I did 2 things, and this is what you're going to build in the tutorial. You have a copy activity, then followed by a data flow, and each one of those has its own deep level activity level monitoring experience. On the data flow side, when you click on the eyeglasses and you look at how your data flow executed, by the way, this is the brand new monitoring experience within data flows. I sent out a tech community update on this week, and so hopefully you're not surprised, because I know you all read my blogs. Sort of, you can't start your day without reading my blog, I'm sure. But if you didn't see that, this is what it looks like. And if you like the old experience, as you zoom in, you'll get the old experience. But we have some customers with very large data flows, so we need to kind of change this to the current same UI sort of layout of the graph. And then at the bottom, you'll be able to see how each of your transformation steps perform. So this is in the tutorial, you will build a data flow with 2 sources. It's going to use the taxi cab trip data. You're going to join that data, and then you can see how the data was partitioned across the Synapse Spark pool, how the partitions were built, the number of rows that were calculated, how long each step took, what was the skewness and kurtosis of that data. You're gonna filter some data. You're still at 2 partitions, by the way, at this point, and that's because the 2 partitions were created in the join, and I'm doing no manual partitioning on this, but I will show you how you can do that. Then we're gonna do a derived column to replace some values. Sort the data. Now, I do not necessarily recommend always sorting the data. In fact, sorting data does not usually make sense within ETL in data flows in the lake, but I'm doing this because I'm doing some data analytics. I'm looking at the data. I'm actually going to view it with you in the UI. So I sorted it and I landed it into a SQL pool then at the end. Okay. And when you want to see what your SQL pool looks like in Synapse, you're going to go over to the data category. And in data category, I have 3 different things. I connected into my blob storage. This is the data lake storage, the Gen 2 that you get with your workspace and your Synapse out of the box. And then you create integration data sets. The integration data sets are essentially Data Factory data sets. They're just called integration data sets when you're over here in Sparkland. And then what comes with your workspace is the databases in the Spark. So there is my my Spark pool, and then here are my SQL pools. So this data flow that you build is going to create this brand new table. I didn't have to create a table definition, it actually creates it on the fly. And it's called taxi demo. And then you can do things like you would do traditionally in SQL Server. You can have a new script that does things like create drop, select top 100 rows. When you are in that experience, the UI looks like this. So this shouldn't be too unfamiliar for you if you've used different object explorers, or if you've used SSMS and whatnot in the past. Okay, so that's the layout. These are the databases. The Spark pools are over here under data. The pipeline is going to be under integrates. So this is the taxi pipeline that you'll build. And then the data flows are under develop. So develop is really a very rich area within the Synapse Studio experience. When you click on new, you're going to see the different things you can do, like a SQL script, a notebook, a data flow, and those things. All right, so to get started with data flows, you're going to go into develop, click on new data flow, and now your experience is just like it is in Data Factory, and you're going to start building your data flow. I have one that's completed because we're very late. I am running out of time, so let's start with my cooking show is going to start with a fully baked cake. And what you see is a end-to-end flow. Now we have two different sources. So you always start with the source. When I create that new data flow, you'll see that you always start with a source. You just click on that source and it's going to prompt you for what source do you want. You have two different source types, a data set and inline. Data set uses the inline data sets that I showed you over here under data, linked integration data sets. You can just pick that from the list. The same ones that you see here will show up down here. And then you can click on inline if you don't want to use a shared integration data set and you just want to just store the definition of the data you want to connect to directly inside of your data flow. You can use inline. That's the difference between inline data set. I have two sources and I'm going to join those. So the way I knew how to join those is I had to explore my data. I didn't necessarily know what the taxi data looks like until I did a data preview. So within your Synapse, what you'll want to do is click on data preview. So here is my source data. If you click data preview and then refresh, you'll get a snapshot of what that data looks like on the Spark pool, on the cluster itself. Every time you click this button here, which I highly recommend, this puts you into this interactive data exploration mode called Data Flow Debug. We spin up a cluster for you, and now you can work with your data and directly interact with the cluster and see the data in real time. So if I knew that these two were the fields made up the primary key and the foreign key that I could use to join them. So I joined them next. And you can explore this data by clicking on a column. This is, of course, exploring the data, looking at the data values. If you click on statistics, you'll get the profile stats that we talked about earlier in the session, where you can see things like your value distributions and whatnot. And then if you click on a numeric value, you'll get a different set of statistics on that. You'll get the percentiles, the variance, min, max, and the value distribution as well. So we're going to join. Join is very straightforward, the different joins that are supported as well as the multiple join conditions. And then we did a filter. So all of these different transformations are available to you from the plus sign, and you'll get the toolbox so you can construct your data flows. We call this a construction paradigm, where you build your ETL data transformation jobs from beginning to end. And in the middle is where you add your transformations. Filtering, in this case, I'm going to take out every vendor that's not equal to CMT. And you can do this by going into the expression builder. So this is probably going to be my last part of the demo because we're running out of time. But the expression builder is where you're going to build all of the good, rich transformation that you want to build within data flows. And it's all fully IntelliSense. So if you start typing in, say, regex, if you want to see all different regex functions, they will launch for you. Hover, get a little bit of help about this. Let's do a regex match. You hover and you get the details of that function definition. If you come down here, you can look for those things in here. There's a like function. You can hover and get examples of that. So just start building it. Also, your incoming data, the metadata, the columns are part of the input schema. And so those will also show up in here. So if you start typing something like rate, you see that rate code is an incoming column. And then last but not least, I'll stop here. This is where you're going to spend most of your time as a derived column. This is where you're going to build these kinds of expressions. This is where I am replacing values. And this is an enumeration. It's an example of enumerations. I used the case statement earlier in the slides for an enumeration. You can do the lookup for enumeration, or you could just do this, do an if statement. So this is the if, saying if rate code is 1, then set it to basic. If everything else is going to be standard. Another way to do this is maybe you have a rate code that's something else, like let's say 2, then you can say is 2, then standard. We would do this. Otherwise, if rate code is 2, then standard. And then you can say maybe other at that point. And so you can embed different if statements in there. Let's say basic. Yeah, advanced. There you go. So you can set different types of ways to essentially enumerate your data and replace values. All right, that's a quick brush through all the different transformation capabilities within data flows and how to clean your data and prep it for those downstream consumers of your data. I'm going to stop here because I'm just about out of time and see if there are any questions.